Hello again. This is Dr. Holly Luttrell from the Fashion Department at Pasadena City College. Um, I just wanted to quickly go over Chapter 2 of your textbook, Survey of Historic Costume. Chapter 2 talks about ancient Egypt and Sumeria and Mesopotamia and a few other ancient civilizations. Your text goes very deeply into it. I just wanted to run through some stuff real quick and add some more images. I think you can see this slide is the publisher's slide, and it's lacking in images, which drives me crazy because when they give you uh, uh, vocabulary, what's most important to me is that you're able to actually identify it. So I want you to, as you're going through the text, whether you use the PowerPoints in these videos or not, I want you to Google the different terms and find valid sources that are primary, meaning images that come from the time period that's being discussed, and make sure that you understand what those terms mean. A lot of times, and what they look like. So if you're in a museum, you can point and identify and say, oh, that's a loincloth. Which you probably know. How about, oh, that's a shenty? So I want you to be able to identify things. So I've added some images. So this is the region that we're talking about in this chapter. And in the book, it goes through a bunch of historical background, which I'll touch on really quickly. We'll start with the Mesopotamians, and they were about 3,500 years before Christ. And it's really hard to talk about what people wore back then because not a lot survives. The Mesopotamians, Sumerians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Egyptians, Romans, etc., they're all trying to inhabit this same area over the course of thousands of years. And so anything that people had would get traded, taken, pilfered. If it didn't disintegrate, it would get reused. Or destroyed or whatever. So there's not a lot of evidence. And then often too, things, even if things got saved, they're forgotten about. So the Vatican in Rome, well, in Vatican City, but inside Italy, they have tons of artifacts, and they don't even know what they have, I think. Maybe they're better about it now, but for years they had no idea. Centuries, they had no idea what they even had. And that's true of all over the world. These civilizations were really famous and intriguing, and when people from different areas would travel and then eventually come back and conquer, they would take things and hide them. So even as recently as World War II, the Nazis were known for taking things and hiding them. And there's a lot of other lesser known factions who took things and hid them. So, point is, it was a long time ago, and we don't have a whole lot to go on. The only things that we get to see are things that were made out of very durable materials, so like stone or metals or that's about it. Sometimes even bone disintegrates, but some of that. But like the fabric is gone. And if we're lucky, we might find some beads, but it's not likely that you'll find them all put together. And even now, if you find something, even if it's something relatively recent, like sometimes things even from as recent as like the 50s or the 60s, you as a modern human aren't really sure how that thing was worn. And so we also need text and we need pictures to tell us how things work. Lucky for us, these civilizations were pretty advanced, and they were into keeping records and reading and writing and accounting. And so that helps us know a lot about their culture and what they valued and a little bit about how they did things. Just like now, we take some things for granted. We assume people know how to do certain things. Like we have ice. Well, how do you make ice? Oh, well, you put it in the freezer. What? A freezer? How do you make a freezer? Well, there is a manual for that somewhere, right? So a lot of these things are taken for granted during any given period in time. So the same is true of these people, and we have some records, but you can see even in this tablet, which has all these little markings on it, that's actual writing, their version of writing. And so the record here is partial, and it's probably pretty worn down and hard to read. But anyway, a lot of things we do know is that they had hierarchical social classes. They had patriarchal, air quotes, monogamous marriages that were by contract, usually to join families and resources. And I say that they were monogamous. It was patriarchal, which means it was run by men, which means that yes, they had a wife, and with being a wife came some status, but dudes also had lots of ladies on the side. And that was, while women didn't have a lot of things they could do in society to sustain themselves, if they didn't have someone to take care of them, or if they came from a lower echelon of society, or they had sick family members they needed to take care of, one way that women could always make money was being somebody's lady on the side. So if you weren't good enough to be his wife, or your family didn't have the stuff, you could be the lady on the side. So divorce was possible, like if women couldn't bear children or something like that, but it was basically a male-dominated society from what we can tell. Um, Through writing, we also know, or we think we know, that clothing was mainly produced from wool around 3,500 years before Christ. Women didn't seem to have much power, but they did seem to be in charge of spinning and weaving textiles. Men did a lot of the dyeing and finishing, and men traveled for textile trade, but women seem to have probably handled the textile production and commerce at home. And here we have an image of someone with the kind of a loom that they would use, which was a backstrap loom. And so they could control the tension with their bodies. We also see here this person wearing a wool garment that's wrapped around the body and something on their head. The staple of fashion 3,500 years before Christ was something called the konaki, and this was made apparently of several materials. Obviously, the aforementioned wool. It was also probably made from sheep skin, and then the wool that wasn't shaved and spun and carded and woven into a textile, but just the straight up wool, seems to have been like cut and shaved and shaped into some kind of a fringe or tiers or tufts. Some of these shapes could have been made from leather, they could have been made from feathers, they could have been made from different treatments weaving wool. Remember, this time period was a pretty long one. We're talking over the span of about 1,000 years, and sometimes more. So probably the technology changed quite a bit. Also notice that a lot of these people seem to be bald-headed, and then the others seem to have really stylized hair. That was because back in these times it was quite common to shave your head, men and women, and then they would wear wigs. And even here, this beard seems to be pretty stylized. It's pretty likely that the beard was also applied, so made out of something, human hair, wool, something, and then tied around the head. And then this wig seems to be swept back and tied into a chignon or a bun, and then fastened with a fillet or a headband. They also had other fancy headdresses and wigs, probably ceremonial or for royalty, or royalty on special occasions. So evidence of that has been found. And then there was jewelry. So they had earrings and necklaces and rings and bracelets and fancy swords, and all kinds of utensils and accessories, and that were made out of natural elements and metals beads and stones and things like that that were polished and carved and inlaid and hand worked into gorgeous pieces. About 1,000 years later, 2,500 years before Christ to about 1,000 years before the Christian era, as they say in your book, things seem to have gotten a little bit more tailored. So you see depictions of women in these statues below, and there appears to be possibly some embroidery around the edges of the garments, and the garments seem to be layered. So instead of just draping the garments around, there appear to be maybe seams. Maybe the garments weren't just shaped like squares. And then you still see the headband, the fillet or the diadems that they used to wear on their heads. And they also still had jewelry. On the smaller half portion of the women's statue, you can see that she's wearing something like a choker as well. And then here a little bit later, so 1,000 years before the Common Era, you can see that the garments are getting a little bit more elaborate. They're still shaving their heads, probably still wearing wigs and tie-on beards that they can stylize. And so they're ceremonial, they mean something. And again, most of the images that are preserved are fancy or ceremonial or important in some way. So probably the regular folk running to the market, a lot of them were just shaved head, but the more important people had the more elaborate costume, as is always the case. We also see in the upper right-hand corner, we see a guy with a brimless hat. That was called a fez or tarbush. Um, and then you see the garments again look a little bit more tailored. So instead of just being a piece of cloth that's wrapped around, the guy in the upper image appears to have a sleeve. And it's a little hard to see, but the guy in the lower image does too. And then we get to the Egyptians. They're world famous. They were always very intriguing. And they were also very prolific. They kept a lot of records and a lot of images. So while they could write, and they had their own form of writing and alphabet and everything, they also did a lot of visual illustrations, which is really helpful for us, because even when historians look back at writing, and if we can decipher what it meant, sometimes there's words for things that don't exist anymore. And so we can use context with pictures and writing to figure out what they're talking about. So the Egyptians had social classes as well, and just like all throughout history, we'll see, the higher the class, the more power, the more money, the more elaborate the costume. And then it went on down the line to people who had next to nothing, and so they didn't wear a whole heck of a lot. And usually things were locally grown, to put it in modern terms. So linen was a big commodity in Egypt, and there was finer linen and less fine linen, just like there is now. And things were more finely woven by more prized and coveted artisans, or just homespun by families at home. And so the homespun, less expensive, lower quality stuff was less desirable, and we have less records of it. And the fancy ceremonial royal stuff that didn't have to be worn every day and got preserved, that we have a little bit more evidence of. So sources of evidence come from art, obviously. Luckily, we have the contents of some tombs that even include depictions of some servants, and while they're, higher echelon slaves and servants, it's still something to give us an idea. They had a lot of decorative motifs that they used, which are ubiquitous, and some of the ones that they talk about in your book are the uraeus, which is sort of the snake symbol that appears on the front headdress of some of the royalty. And then they have a scarab, which is a beetle that appears everywhere, another symbol for protection and royal power and good health and all kinds of things. The other one is the Eye of Horus. Horus is a god that's usually represented in some sort of a bird manifestation, and then the Eye of Horus is this symbol here with the eye with the protrusion coming down low and like a stylized eyebrow above it. Incidentally, the Egyptians shaved off most of their body hair, and their eyebrows were also applied. They just felt it was cleaner and more hygienic. And so they would draw their eyebrows on, they would put makeup on, and they would use um, coal, and they would grind up different minerals to create colors so they could have color in their makeup and in their paintings and on their clothing and their textiles. Here we see an image of some people and what they're wearing. So Egypt and these civilizations that we talk about in this chapter, they're in an environment where you didn't need to wear clothing for protection from like the cold. So most of what people wore was for comfort and more often for decoration and to symbolize something, status or station, or just, you know, wealth. Hey, look at me, aren't I awesome? So all these people here are wearing wigs. They would have had their heads shaved as well as the rest of their body hair. This guy here, he's wearing an animal skin, some kind of a cat. That symbolizes someone in a particular position in society. Right now, it escapes me whether it was like a scribe or someone in a religious position. I can't remember, but this is some sort of a ceremonial um, depiction here. And you see how they have like little lumps on the tops of their wigs? Those are cones of scented wax that acted like a perfume, and they would melt throughout the day so they would smell good. We also can see that they have something on their feet, some sort of a simple open sandal. We can see a lot of what's going on. We can see the decoration that were made out of beads that are on their heads. We can see the pectorals or the necklaces, the big wide necklace that sits on their shoulders. Those were made out of beads as well. They're wearing transparent pleated garments that were wrapped and draped so that some of them have sleeves. And it looks like they're layers, and it also looks like they're pleated. The Egyptian kingdom lasted for a really long time, and it was divided into periods. So we have Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom. And often one of the things that we use to differentiate, because again, a lot of the artwork and a lot of the evidence we have of the kingdom was images, and even their writing had these symbols. And so one of the ways we differentiate the kingdoms is by the crown. So we have different crowns for the different kingdoms. They show that in your book as well. So we already talked quite a bit about this image, so I'm just going to skip over it. So some more things that men wore were loincloths, aprons, wrapped skirts, and they had a lot of words for the wrapped skirt, shanty, shent, skent, and a few different spellings, because over the years, different archaeologists and historians who unearth these things and try and figure out what the words say and how they would have been pronounced and things like that. They come up with different names for things. And sometimes historians are just giving modern terms to, because they don't know what the ancient term was, so they come up with some way to describe it. So they had these wrapped skirts which were really ubiquitous, and we'll look at those in another image. And they had some upper body coverings. We start to see like T-shaped garments, which you can kind of see here. So if this was laying out flat, you could see that it would come across the shoulder and then down the arm and then maybe cut under the armpit and then straight down. So it's kind of a T-shaped. And they had shawls and cloaks and again, all the same cool jewelry and things like that. So they had, for women, they had skirts, they had wrapped dresses or sheaths, they had these bead net dresses. There's more images of them in your textbook. It's amazing that these survived. And then they had pleated and long wrapped dresses, and they had tunics and V-necked shaped dresses too. And a lot of these garments were transparent. So these bead dresses may have been worn with nothing underneath them except the nude body. And a lot of historians say that the woman's naked body was not um, sexual, it just wasn't taboo. Not to say it wasn't sexual, but it wasn't taboo. And so it was okay to walk around with most of your skin showing and not much coverage. So a lot of the sheath dresses and the wraps were also transparent, like we saw in this mural here. They appear to be transparent because they are. So you can see the outline of her body underneath this, and that was real. So again, the hair and headdresses, they shaved their heads and their eyebrows and as much hair as they could get off their body. They had simple sandals, usually made out of leather, but sometimes also out of reeds or some kind of a plant matter that was woven thickly. They had all kinds of jewelry, including diadems, which were kind of like a headband. They had a lot of cosmetics, henna and kohl, and lots of other colored things that they would mix together to create different effects. Here's a image infographic from your book that shows the different crowns that differentiate not only the different kingdoms, lower, middle, and new, but also different statuses. So they talk about like the lock of youth, which was worn by children of the royal family, so it's like a lesser wig. And the uraeus again, which is that snake on the front. So you can review this in your text, but I just wanted to point that out to you and make sure that you're familiar with the different crowns. So they took two of the crowns, the red crown and the white crown, and then they combined them when different kingdoms joined, and then they changed them to mean different things. So just make sure you take a look at that in your book and read about that. They also, usually the components for children were simpler, and you had different outfits that would denote different statuses or different jobs or different activities. So, like that one mural I was saying, the guy wearing the cat skin, I think he was, that denoted something religious. And then soldiers had different kinds of dress, and also depending on their rank. And then musicians and dancers and athletes, they all had different things that they would wear. So these are entertainers, like at a party, and so they're decorated in different ways, and they're in various states of dress and undress. So athletes and dancers, they needed more movement, so their costumes were different than someone who, like, say, was playing an instrument and just needed to stand still. But it was all about decoration. It always is. And decoration for beauty and to symbolize an activity or a status or an accomplishment of some sort. So in your book, they always give these nice visual summary tables to let you see what people wore throughout the ages. So it's kind of like a timeline. It's a little sort of kind of reminiscent of that timeline project that you have to do for this class. And I also want to point out that while this text is a valid source of information, meaning they've verified the information that they're given to you, presumably. It's not perfect, but it's pretty darn good. Um, Not all the sources in the book are primary. So this drawing is not a primary source. This was compiled by someone who was not alive during these times. Obviously, one person could not have been alive from 3,500 years before the Common Era all the way through to, when Christ was born. So this is not a primary source because this image that we're looking at right now did not exist during the times that it depicted. When you're doing work for this class, please be sure to make certain that you're using valid sources. You're getting them from someone that's in the know. So not Pinterest, but the Met or LACMA or MoCA or some museum or school that's in Egypt, let's say, for this particular chapter. You can use diagrams like these that were created later to clarify, right? Because some of these diagrams are easier to see than some eroded stone or some eroded mural or painting, right? So a primary source like this that was created by an Egyptian in ancient Egypt, that's a primary source. And it's valid because it came from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and they have a reputation for making sure that the things that they're telling you about, they know where they came from and they know a lot of the provenance. So make sure that you're using primary sources like this, and it's okay to use other diagrams as well, but you must include at least one primary source. So that's it for chapter 2. Make sure you peek through the book, and hopefully this little video helped you out a bit, and I'll see you in chapter 3.